Welcome back to Living Pardes. At the beginning of the ministry of Yeshua, or Jesus, he stood up in his local synagogue in Nazareth, opened the scroll of Isaiah, and read, "The Spirit of Jehovah is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." After this, Yeshua proclaims to those in the synagogue that, "Today, in your hearing, this is fulfilled." If you look back at our most recent videos about the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel chapter 9, you will see that Yeshua likely read this portion of Scripture on the first day of Aviv in 27 CE. This would have been the first day of the Jewish calendar of that year. When we look at the portion of Isaiah that Yeshua quotes, and that he states is being fulfilled in their hearing, I would suggest that Yeshua was proclaiming that it was being fulfilled due to the beginning of a year of Jubilee in the land. At the same time, Yeshua was also proclaiming that they were beginning the first year of the new Jubilee cycle. Yeshua was essentially pointing out something that had not been celebrated in the land of Israel for hundreds of years. He was pointing out that they were currently in the Year of Jubilee. This means that the year of the Lord's favor was not only referencing the start of Yeshua's ministry, but was identifying the current year as a Jubilee year. And as part of the requirements of the Year of Jubilee, Yeshua was 1. Proclaiming the good news to the poor, 2. Proclaiming liberty to the captives, 3. Recovering of sight to the blind, and 4. Setting at liberty those who are oppressed. If you continue watching to the end of this video, you will see that the scriptures and the historical evidence demonstrate that 27 CE was actually a year of Jubilee in the land of Israel. Once one realizes that Yeshua was restoring and proclaiming that 27 CE was a year of Jubilee, then we find that we will also be able to calculate when all the years of Jubilee occurred throughout history, and when the next Jubilee will occur in our lifetime. At the same time, by the end of this video, I am sure that you will understand why I believe we are about to experience what I like to refer to as the crescendo of all prophecy. Some may ask, what is the Year of Jubilee? In the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, we find the commands of Jehovah in regard to the Year of Jubilee. As chapter 25 starts, we first find the law of the Sabbath year. You see, just as Jehovah commanded that every person rest once every 7 days, he also commanded that his people allow the land to rest 1 year out of every 7 years. As it states, Jehovah then spoke to Moshe, or Moses, at Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its crops. But during the 7th year the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to Jehovah." Thus, once the people entered into the land which Jehovah had given to them, then he commanded that the land should have a Sabbath rest. After this, they should work the land for 6 years, and then the 7th year allow it to rest. As we saw in our previous videos, prior to the Babylonian captivity, Israel did not keep this command, and as punishment for this and other abominations, they went into the Babylonian captivity for 70 years to allow the land to rest for all the years that they did not keep the command. After the rules related to the Sabbath years are explained, we then find that Leviticus 25 takes us through the instructions in regard to the years of Jubilee. These are sometimes referred to as the laws of release. This is because during the year of Jubilee, in addition to allowing the land to rest in that year, Jehovah also commands that the children of Israel free their slaves or indentured servants. Jehovah commanded that his people free anyone in bondage once every 50 years, as it states, You are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourselves, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. You shall sound a horn all through your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land for all inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow, nor reap its aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines. For it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you, and you shall eat its crops out of the field. Basically, any person placed into slavery would be freed during the year of Jubilee. At the same time, debts would be canceled, and people's lands would also be returned to the original owners. Essentially, this was an economic reset for those in the land. The Jubilee year followed after 7 consecutive Sabbath cycles, or 7 Sabbath rest years. The Sabbath rest year is also known as a Shemitah year. The period of 7 years between Shemitah years is the Shemitah cycle. For as one Shemitah cycle is 7 years composed of 6 years of work with a 7th year of rest, the Jubilee cycle consists of 7 Shemitah cycles for a total of 49 years. Then on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the 49th year, they would sound a horn to proclaim the 50th year to be the year of Jubilee. Now when Yeshua started his ministry, he was first baptized by John. Then he went into the desert to be tempted. Afterwards, he returned to his hometown of Nazareth. Then on the first day of Aviv, on the first day of the Jewish New Year in 27 CE, he stood up in his synagogue to proclaim good news to the poor, liberty to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. All of these statements are consistent with the Year of Jubilee. If in fact the year 27 CE was the Year of Jubilee, and Yeshua was proclaiming that it was, then we should find evidence within the Scriptures, other ancient writings, or historical records that would bear witness to the truth. Yet before we start looking at the evidence for this argument, I would like to consider how the years of Jubilee would be counted. Initially, it would seem obvious that one would count 7 7-year periods, or 49 years, and the next year would be the 50th year. So after 49 years, a 50th year comes. Then we begin the next 49-year cycle. This would make every 50 years equal to a year of Jubilee. Yet when we consider how other things are counted according to the Torah, we find that counting the years of Jubilee is not that simple. For example, according to Leviticus 12, verse 3, after a male child is born, he is to be circumcised on the 8th day of life. Accordingly, there are only 7 days in a week, with the last day of the week being the Sabbath. Thus, the 8th day of life is also the first day of the 2nd week. When comparing this to the year of Jubilee, a significant question arises. Does the 50th year work as a separator between two 49-year Jubilee cycles, or is the 50th year actually the first year of the next Jubilee cycle? In other words, do we count 49 years, add a year 50, then count another 49 years? Or do we count 49 years, then start over with the first year of the next 49-year cycle, also being the 50th year of the previous cycle, as is the case of the 8th day with circumcision? If it is the former, it makes counting much easier, as you would only have to count every 50 years. If it is the latter, only the first Jubilee came in the 50th year, but from then on, the Jubilee is actually counted every 49 years because it always falls on the first year of the next Sabbath cycle. Though I believe that this can be quite confusing, I would suggest that the latter way of counting the Jubilee cycles is actually the correct way. According to ancient Jewish traditions and writings, the Jewish people have not actually observed the year of Jubilee since around 700 BCE, when Israel began its captivity. According to the modern interpretation of the Torah in Rabbinic Judaism, the Jubilee year only applies when the children of Israel are actually living in the land, according to their tribes. As such, since the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, the tribes have not actually been living in the land in accordance with their tribes. Therefore, it was not necessary for them to observe the years of Jubilee. According to Maimonides, the ancient Jewish rabbi and philosopher who lived around 1138 to 1204 CE, he wrote that the years of Jubilee were actually still counted after the Babylonian exile and throughout the Second Temple period, but the observance of the years of the Jubilee did not occur. If Maimonides is correct, and Judah was still keeping track and counting the years of Jubilee throughout the Second Temple period without actually observing the tradition, then ancient writings of that period may give us clues as to how the years of Jubilee should be counted. I believe that one ancient writing does show us how the years of Jubilee were counted. This writing just so happens to be called the Book of Jubilees. Though I do not look at this text as a scriptural source, I do see this text as a source for historical knowledge, demonstrating for us how the ancient Judeans thought and what teachings were circulating within the Jewish religion at the time it was written. This book is believed to have been written sometime around 160 to 100 BCE, or during the Second Temple period. And it does clearly demonstrate how the ancient Jews perceived time and the years of Jubilee within the Second Temple period. For example, in the Book of Jubilees we read, Jubilees 45:13. And Israel, or Jacob, lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, and all the days which he lived were 3 Jubilees, 147 years. In this we see that all the days of Jacob, or Israel, were 3 Jubilees, which equals 147 years. If 3 Jubilee cycles were counted as periods of time equal to 50 years each, then Jacob's total lifespan would have been 150 years. Yet, according to this text, 3 Jubilee cycles equals 147 years. If the Jubilee cycles are counted as 49 years each, because the 50th year is actually the first year of the next Jubilee cycle, then we see that 147 years is exactly 3 Jubilees. Just to show you that this is not a one-time thing, let us consider Jubilee 23:8. According to this chapter, Abraham died, and it states, and he lived 3 Jubilees and 4 weeks of years, 175 years, and completed the days of his life, being old and full of days. In this we see that Abraham lived a total of 3 Jubilees as well as 4 weeks of years, which totals 175 years. So as we previously saw, 3 Jubilees is equal to 147 years. Then we must note that a week of years is the Shemitah cycle, which totals 7 years each. If he lived 4 additional weeks of years, this would be a total of 4 times 7. 4 weeks of years equals 28 years. So if Abraham lived 3 Jubilee cycles, which equals 147 years, and 4 more Shemitah cycles, which is equal to 28 years, then we find that Abraham lived a total of 175 years. This then demonstrates, at the time of the writing of the Book of Jubilees, the ancient Judeans understood that there were actually 49 years between Jubilees and not 50 years. Otherwise, Abraham would have lived for 178 years. With this being noted, we must conclude that the ancient Jews counted the 50th year of a Jubilee cycle to be the first year of the next Jubilee cycle, which causes there to only be 49 years in between each Jubilee year. Now that we know how to count the years of Jubilee, and if we assume that Yeshua was referencing the year of Jubilee when he was reading from Isaiah at the beginning of his ministry in 27 CE, then we know several different things. First, if 27 CE was a year of Jubilee, then every 49 years before and after would be further years of Jubilee. This would allow us to figure out every year of Jubilee throughout history, from when they began to be counted until the end of time. Second, we also know that the start date for every Jubilee cycle is also the start date for a Shemitah cycle or a Sabbath cycle. Third, we also know that the year before every Jubilee year is a Sabbath year or a Shemitah year for the land. With all of this new information at hand, then we have everything we need to verify whether or not 27 CE was actually a year of Jubilee, as all of the known Shemitah years and Jubilees throughout history should harmonize with the 27 CE Jubilee year. For this reason, I have created a chart which lays out the years in which the Jubilees would have occurred and when the next Jubilee will occur according to this timeline. Within Scripture, we know that the countdown to the first year of Jubilee officially started when the children of Israel entered into the land which was allotted for them as their inheritance. However, this does not point to a specific year. Yet I believe there is a hint within the Scriptures that provides us with an actual year when a Jubilee was beginning. This can be found within the book of Ezekiel 40 verse 1, where it states, "In the 25th year of our captivity, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, in the 14th year after the fall of the city, on that day the hand of Jehovah was upon me, and he took me there." It must be noted that throughout history, many have believed that this scripture reveals a year of Jubilee, based on the idea that only at the beginning of a year of Jubilee does the 7th month of the year stand out. Here in Ezekiel, though it does not specifically reference the 7th month, we see that in the Hebrew it does reference the 7th month, as it states, "At the beginning of the year on the 10th of the month." When reading this, most would assume that this is speaking about the 10th day of the first month of the year, on the 10th day of Aviv. However, when we look at the Hebrew, it states that it is occurring at the beginning of the year, Be Rosh Hashanah. While most know that according to Exodus 12 verse 2, Aviv is known as the head of months and marks the beginning of the Jewish calendar year, there is also a Jewish New Year known as Rosh Hashanah. It is often referred to as the Civil New Year. Rosh Hashanah means beginning or head of the year. It occurs on the first day of Tishrei, which is the 7th month of the liturgical year. Why is this important? This is because according to Leviticus 25, we see that it states, "You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land." So we mark the Jubilee year by sounding the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. This then marks the coming of the Jubilee year, which begins the 50th year. The first day of that 7th month is Rosh Hashanah. In Ezekiel 40 verse 1, we see that he is referring to the 10th day of the 7th month, which is right after Rosh Hashanah. This was only called the beginning of the year when it was proclaiming the coming of the Jubilee year. If in fact Ezekiel 40 is revealing to us the coming of a Jubilee year, then we can calculate when it occurred by looking at the clues that Ezekiel gives, namely the 25th year of the captivity and the 14th year after the destruction of the city. When most people read Ezekiel 40 verse 1, they often consider the city to be Jerusalem, and as such, they then conclude that this section means 14 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple occurring in 587 BC. Then they conclude that 25 years after the captivity means that 11 years prior to the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem is when the captivity started for Ezekiel. In other words, Ezekiel would have been taken into captivity around 598 BCE, and he is writing 25 years after the captivity and 14 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Though many believe this to be true, I do not agree with this, and I believe that Ezekiel himself clarifies this earlier in the book. Though I do agree that the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed in 587 BC, I do not believe this to be the city which Ezekiel refers to as being destroyed in this text. I believe that it is a different city that Ezekiel has in his mind as referenced in Ezekiel 40 verse 1. Here is why. In Ezekiel 26, we find that Ezekiel prophesies against the city of Tyre while he is in Babylon. It states, "And it came to pass in the 11th year, on the first day of the month, that the word of Jehovah came to me, saying, Son of man, because Tyre has said in regard to Jerusalem, Aha, the gateway of the peoples is broken. It has opened to me. I shall be filled now that she is laid waste. Therefore, this is what Jehovah Elohim says, Behold, I am against you, Tyre, and I will bring up many nations against you, as the sea brings up its waves. They will destroy the walls of Tyre and tear down her towers, and I will sweep her debris away from her and make her a bare rock." In this we see that Ezekiel is prophesying in the 11th year on the first day of the month. We must ask, the 11th year of what? It is the 11th year of the captivity. According to our previous timeline, whereas the captivity started in 598 BC and the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem occurred in 587 BC, then Ezekiel prophesying in the 11th year would mean that Ezekiel is prophesying in 587 BCE, which is when the temple was destroyed. And what day was he prophesying on? It states that he was prophesying on the first day of the month in the 11th year of the captivity. He was prophesying on the first day of the 11th year, or Aviv 1 in 587 BC. Yet, we must also note that according to this, the city of Jerusalem had already been destroyed, meaning that on the first day of this 11th year, the city was already in ruins. When we then compare this verse with Ezekiel 40 verse 1, and note that 40 verse 1 is occurring 14 years after the fall of Jerusalem, as well as 25 years after the beginning of the captivity, then we find that verse 26 would have to be an error. Here is how we know. If the destruction of the temple occurred sometime before the first day of the 11th year of the captivity, then the temple and the city would necessarily have been destroyed in the 10th year of the captivity. If on the original timeline the captivity began in 598 BC, then the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem had to have occurred sometime in 588 BC, inasmuch that there was time for Tyre to ridicule its destruction according to Ezekiel 26. This means that in Ezekiel 40 verse 1, the destruction of Jerusalem had to have occurred at a minimum of 15 years before the account found in Ezekiel 40 verse 1, but it states that it actually occurred 14 years prior. Let me now demonstrate what I believe Ezekiel 26 and 40 are showing to us. If we consider the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem to have occurred in 587 BC, and if we consider this to mark the beginning of the captivity, then 25 years later, it would place the occurrence in Ezekiel 40 verse 1 in 562 BC. At the same time, with the occurrence of Ezekiel 40 occurring in 562 BCE, then the destruction of a city would have to have occurred 14 years prior to this, which would mean that a city was destroyed around 576 BC. When Ezekiel was prophesying about the destruction of the city of Tyre, it placed his action occurring on the first day in the 11th year of the captivity. If we count the start of the captivity in 587 BC, then the first day of the 11th year places it in 576 BC, which then lines up with the timeline of Ezekiel 40. If we remember that he prophesied about the destruction of Tyre on the first day of the year in 576 BC, and we know that Tyre was destroyed, it might be helpful to know a little about this destruction. If we want to analyze the destruction of Tyre, we first need to look at its geography and history. Historically, the city of Tyre was associated with two locations, which are located in the modern country of Lebanon. One location was on the mainland, which is often called Old Tyre, and the other location was on a nearby small island, which we can call New Tyre. The island on which New Tyre was built was separated from the mainland Old Tyre by a shallow strait. What we know is that while Ezekiel was in Babylon, Tyre was besieged by the Babylonians for 13 years. This occurred from 586 to 573 BC. Sometime before 573 BC, the mainland city of Tyre was destroyed. After that, the Babylonians attempted to build a bridge to the island. They never destroyed the island city, but they did fully destroy the mainland city. However, the island city did finally surrender to Babylon in 573 BC. Thus, I would argue that the city which Ezekiel was referring to in Ezekiel 41 is the mainland city of Old Tyre, which was destroyed around 576 BC. This is also what Ezekiel was prophesying about on the first day of the 11th year of this captivity, meaning that 14 years later, Ezekiel 40 verse 1 occurred, after the destruction of the mainland city of Tyre in 576. After this, the Babylonians continued their siege against the island until they surrendered in 573 BC. With this in mind, we find that Ezekiel 40 was likely talking about the year 562 BC, which was 25 years after the official start of the captivity in 587 BC, and 14 years after the destruction of Tyre, which was prophesied about 14 years earlier. Thus, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, or 10 days after Rosh Hashanah in 562 BCE, pointing out that Ezekiel 40 verse 1 was the year in which the shofars would have blown, proclaiming the coming of the Year of Jubilee beginning in 561 BC. If we then return to our chart, we find that if 27 CE was a Jubilee year, then 561 BC was also a Jubilee year, demonstrating a perfect harmonization of the texts and the timeline. Now that we have harmonized the two Jubilees in our timeline, we find that the fun really begins. As a historical reference, we find that according to the Talmud, it states that the people of Israel counted 17 Jubilees from the time they entered the land of Canaan until their exile at the destruction of the first temple. Thus, if we count back 17 Jubilees from the Jubilee found in Ezekiel 40 verse 1, we find that the first Jubilee that was celebrated would have occurred in 1345 BC. However, this is not when they entered into the land, but rather only the first Jubilee that they celebrated. This means that before this Jubilee, they counted 7 Shemitah cycles, or 49 years, and this first Jubilee occurred in the 50th year. This places the year that the children of Israel entered into the land, which they inherited in the year 1395 BC, and the year they began counting the Jubilees in the year 1394 BC, as it stated in Leviticus 25:2. When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto Jehovah. So in the first year, when they gained their allotted portion, they celebrated a Sabbath year. Then they would start counting the Jubilees, placing us on track for a 49-year count through history, with the previous year being the Sabbath year. As we will see later in this video, though the Israelites only began counting the Jubilees at this time, Jehovah has been maintaining the Jubilees since the time of Adam. Now here's where some things become tricky. You see, another key to restoring the Jubilee timeline is based on when the counting actually began. According to Leviticus 25:2, it states, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto Jehovah." This means that the counting did not begin until the children of Israel entered the land which Jehovah gave them. This does not mean that they began counting the moment they crossed the Jordan and entered into the land of Canaan. After they crossed the Jordan and entered into the land of Canaan, they wandered and battled the inhabitants of the land for 7 years. And after that 7 years of battle, then the children of Israel gained possession of their land, and Jehovah portioned out the land in accordance with each of their tribes. How do we know this? First, we find that according to the Talmud, it states, during the first year after the Exodus, Moses constructed the tabernacle. During the second year, the tabernacle was erected, and Moses sent out the spies. Consequently, how old was Caleb when the Jewish people crossed the Jordan? He was 80 less 2, or 78 years old. When Joshua was dividing the land of Israel into inheritances, Caleb said to him, I am 85 years old. It is therefore found that they conquered the land for 7 years. we find that this quote in the Babylonian Talmud is referencing Joshua 14, where it states, 40 years old I was when Moses, the servant of Jehovah, sent me out of Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I came bringing him back word just as it was in my heart. And my brothers who went up with me caused the heart of the people to melt. But as for me, I followed Jehovah, my Elohim, fully. Consequently, Moses swore on that day, saying, the land upon which your feet have trodden will become yours and your sons, as an inheritance to time indefinite, because you have followed Jehovah, my Elohim, fully. And now, here Jehovah has preserved me alive, just as he promised. These 45 years since Jehovah made this promise to Moses, even while Israel wandered in the wilderness, today I am 85 years old. So in this, we find that Caleb stated that he was 40 years old when he was sent to spy out the land. At the same time, this did occur after the building and erecting of the tabernacle in the wilderness. According to the Talmud, this process took around 2 years, and there is no reason to really question this, especially as we see how things work out on our timeline. Thus, Caleb was 38 years old when he left Egypt and began walking in the wilderness. Accordingly, the children of Israel wandered in the desert for 40 years before crossing the Jordan and entering into the land of Canaan. Therefore, Caleb was 78 years old when they entered into the land of Canaan. After entering into the land of Canaan, they battled throughout the land. Then once the land was conquered, it was allotted to the children of Israel, in accordance with their tribes. According to Joshua 14:10, Caleb was allotted his land when he was 85 years old. This means that from the time they entered into the land until the time they were allotted their land by Jehovah, 7 years had passed. Therefore, we have 3 new numbers to add to the timeline. So the counting of the Jubilees began when they were allotted their land, and 7 years before this time, they crossed the Jordan and entered into Canaan. This also means that the children of Israel attained their allotted land in 1395 BC, meaning that BC 1395 was the 7th year that they were in the land of Canaan, which was to them a Sabbath rest year and the year they took possession of the land. This means they then crossed the Jordan River in 1401 BC. At the same time, we also know that they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and therefore they left Egypt in 1441 BC. To verify this timeline, we will use another scripture found in 1 Kings chapter 6, where it states in verse 1, and it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out from the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month that he began to build the house of Jehovah. So according to this, Solomon started to begin building the temple of Jehovah 480 years after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. As such, if they left Egypt in 1441 BC, then Solomon's temple was beginning to be built in 961 BC. As we observed in our previous video, it is commonly believed among historians that Solomon's temple began to be built around 961 to 960 BC, showing that our timeline is in line with this tradition. When we return back to the Book of Jubilees, we find something else that is very interesting. According to the Book of Jubilees, chapter 50, verses 1 through 4, it states that 49 Jubilees, 1 week and 2 years had passed since the time of Adam until the time when Jehovah gave the Torah in the desert of Sin to Moses, which included the instructions regarding the Shemitah years and the Jubilee years. After receiving the Torah, there were yet 40 years to come for learning the commandments of Jehovah until they passed over to the land of Canaan, crossing the Jordan to the west. In other words, according to this tradition found within the Book of Jubilees, from the time of Adam until the time they left Egypt and gained the Torah, it was 49 Jubilees, 2 years and 1 week. After this, the children of Israel would spend 40 more years in the wilderness for instruction purposes before they enter into the land of Canaan. So they entered into the land of Canaan 2 years plus 40 years after the 49th Jubilee, or 42 years after the 49th Jubilee from Adam. In other words, they entered into the land 42 years into the next Jubilee cycle. And as we saw previously, after they passed into the land, they inherited their land 7 years later, totaling 49 years, or taking us to the end of the Shemitah or Jubilee cycle, which was exactly the year which they received their allotted portions, and it was a Sabbath year. The next year was the first year of the next Jubilee cycle and the 50th Jubilee since Adam. This then works out precisely with the timeline, and if Jubilees chapter 50 is true, then we also find that we can calculate the Jubilees back to the time of Adam, for whatever that means. Yet, before we go there, let us first consider what we have found so far. First, we found that the statements that Yeshua made at the beginning of his ministry were consistent with a year of Jubilee. As such, when Yeshua came, he began his ministry within a Jubilee year in 27 CE. This also means that if they would have been celebrating the Jubilee at that time in history, the shofar would have been sounded on the 10th day of the 7th month in 26 CE, signaling the coming of the Jubilee year. Second, once we located this year of Jubilee and we figured out how to count the years of Jubilee, we were then able to calculate all of the rest of the Jubilees throughout history. Third, we found that Ezekiel 40 verse 1 was likely referencing the coming of the Jubilee year, and time and events within that verse demonstrate that it did indeed fall precisely in place for a Jubilee year, which validates the 27 CE Jubilee year for the beginning of Yeshua's ministry. After this, we not only found when the children of Israel crossed the Jordan River, but we were also able to pinpoint the year the Exodus from Egypt began. With this information, we found that the date of the Exodus precisely lined up with 1 Kings and the start of the building of Solomon's temple in 961 BC. Finally, using the Book of Jubilees as another historical reference, we were able to confirm how precisely its record of the Exodus also lined up with our timeline for when the children of Israel were allotted their lands. Now, whether this may or may not seem like a lot of evidence, there is one more line of evidence we can look at to demonstrate that the 27 CE timeline is a correct timeline for the Jubilees. This can be found through the Sabbath or the Shemitah years. As was stated earlier, once we found the Jubilee years, we know that the previous year would be a Shemitah year. And as such, every 7 years before and after it would also be a Shemitah year, as they would work the land for 6 years and then rest in the 7th year. Therefore, if we can find noted Shemitah years throughout history, if this timeline is correct, then the Shemitah years would necessarily have to line up with the Jubilee cycles as well. For this reason, we will look at several Shemitah years that have been documented in history. When we look back at our previous video in regard to the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel chapter 9, we find that we mentioned 2 years that were Shemitah years. The first we found to be around 37 to 36 BC, when Herod became king, as Josephus wrote that a Shemitah year was still going on when Herod became king of Judea. According to our timeline, this time fits precisely as a Shemitah year, as the nearest Jubilee would have occurred in 22 BC. The year before it would have been 23 BC, which would have been a Shemitah year, with the previous Shemitah cycle occurring in 30 BC, and the Shemitah cycle before that would have been 37 BC. Thus, when the Sabbath cycle spans 2 years, or Gregorian years, we find that the Shemitah cycle would have occurred between 37 and 36 BC, lining up precisely with the year Herod became king of Judea and when it would be required for the land to rest. We also found in that same video that a Shemitah year occurred 7 years before this, in the years from 44 to 43 BCE, which was just after Julius Caesar gave a command to Hyrcanus II to rebuild and restore Jerusalem. Historians also believe that 162 BC was within a sabbatical year, based on the second year of Antiochus Eupator's reign, when Judah Maccabee laid siege to the garrison in the citadel at Jerusalem. This can be found in the writings of Josephus and 1 Maccabees. When we look at our list of Jubilees, we find that the closest Jubilee to 162 BC is 169 BC. Therefore, we know that the year before 169 BC was 170 BC, which was a Sabbath year. Then when we add 7 years to it, we then find that a Shemitah year occurred from 163 to 162 BC, again lining up with our timeline. Furthermore, it is noted within the records that the siege ended at the end of the Shemitah year, which would have placed it in 162 BC. Next, if we consider John Hyrcanus and his siege of Ptolemy in the fortress of Dagon, which is described both in Josephus and 1 Maccabees, it stated that during this time a Shemitah year started. From the chronological information provided in these texts, we find that 135 BC was also a Shemitah year, which also lines up with our timeline. Now, according to the Babylonian Talmud, it reports that the Second Temple was destroyed the year after a Shemitah year. As it states, it was the year after a sabbatical year, and likewise, the same happened when the Second Temple was destroyed. If the Second Temple was destroyed a year after a Shemitah year, then we must find out whether or not the year before the Temple's destruction was a Shemitah year, and if it lines up with our timeline. According to the historical records, the Second Temple was destroyed in AD 70. This would mean that a Sabbath year would have occurred in AD 69. If we accept AD 70 as the year of the destruction, then, according to our timeline, the closest year of Jubilee to AD 70 occurred in AD 76. 7 years prior to this takes us to AD 69. If we add 1 extra year for the Sabbath year, we find that a Shemitah year occurred from 68 to 69 CE. Therefore, we do find that a Shemitah year did occur 1 year prior to the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70. Now, these are only 5 known Shemitah years that line up with our timeline. Yet, for the sake of the length of this video, I will stop here and allow you to find and test the rest. Now that we have found that a year of Jubilee occurring in 27 CE lines up with at least 1 known Jubilee in Scripture and 5 other historically known Shemitah cycles, it is time to consider when the next Jubilee is set to occur. In finding this, we will not only observe when the next Jubilee is scheduled to occur, but we will see that the next Jubilee year has the potential to be one of the most significant Jubilees in the history of humanity. You see, if we count out the Jubilees, we find that the next Jubilee is set to occur between 2036 and 2037. This means that if it were to be celebrated, the shofar or the trumpet would blow on the 10th day of the 7th month in 2035 to proclaim the coming year of Jubilee, which will start on the 1st of Aviv in 2036 until the last day of the Jewish year in 2037. Furthermore, if we count out how many occurred from the time of Messiah until the next Jubilee, you will find something very significant. First, as we observed in our previous video about Daniel chapters 8 and 12, 2037 is exactly 70 years from when the events of 1967 occurred. This was when the Jews, or Israel, took back Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, fulfilling the prophecies found in Daniel chapters 8 and 12. Accordingly, 70 years is known to be a generation, according to Psalms 90 verse 10, which states, "The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away." So the next Jubilee will occur at the end of the generation, or 70 years after Daniel 8 and 12 were fulfilled in 1967, when Israel or the Jews regained possession of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. Remember, according to Matthew 24, the generation that sees all of the things within that text fulfilled will not pass until the coming of the Son of Man. Next, in relation to the term generation, I would like us to consider the genealogy of Yeshua as found in Matthew chapter 1. I believe that within it we find a hidden mystery. I refer to it as one of the mysteries of the genealogies. This chapter of Matthew specifically addresses the generation of Yeshua, the Messiah. You see, according to Matthew chapter 1, we find that it states that these are the generations of Jesus Christ, or Yeshua HaMashiach. Then it lists the genealogy of Yeshua, starting with Abraham. After listing the relatives, it states in Matthew 1:17, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations, and from the carrying away into Babylon until Christ are 14 generations. This seems simple. It is saying that there are a total of 3 sets of 14, or 42 generations, from Abraham until Mashiach, or Christ. The problem is, if you actually go through the genealogy and count out every individual in the lineage, you will find that Yeshua is actually the 41st generation. Is this a lie? Well, some claim that somewhere in history, a scribe left one of the ancestors in the lineage out. This is fine if it is true. It still shows that the generation of Yeshua Mashiach, or of Jesus Christ, is the 42nd generation. However, I am not sure that this is the case. I believe that there is something even more to this. You see, if Yeshua was the 41st generation, yet this says that there were 42 generations until Christ, or the Messiah, does this mean that the 42nd generation is actually made up of those born again through the Messiah? According to Romans 8, through Christ we have the power to become the sons of God, or the sons of Elohim. Is this saying that the 42nd generation is the generation of Yeshua HaMashiach, or the generation of Jesus Christ? We are the children birthed through his death and resurrection and the coming of his Holy Spirit within us. We are that remnant of believers. We are his kin, also his body and his church, the ecclesia, those who have been called out of the world into a new life. Why is this important as it relates to the Year of Jubilee? This is because, along with 2037 being the end of the next Jubilee, which starts in 2036, and the 70th year of the generation of those that regained possession of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, the Jubilee of 2036 and 2037 is also exactly 42 Jubilees since Yeshua's ministry started in 27 CE. Does this mean that the fullness of the generation of Yeshua HaMashiach, or Jesus Christ, will be completed in 2037? Let us further consider that along with this being the 42nd Jubilee since Yeshua, it will also be the 70th Jubilee since Israel gained possession of their land in ancient Israel. So besides it being the 70th year for the generation that fulfilled Daniel chapters 8 and 12, it will also be the 70th Jubilee, or the 70th set of 7 times 7, since Israel initially inherited the land in 1395 BC. Could this be a direct link to Daniel chapter 9, as it states, 77s are determined upon your people and upon your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up both vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Could this be the 4th fulfillment in the timeline, fulfilling the 70 weeks or the 77th prophecy found in Daniel chapter 9? If you would like to see the other 3 fulfillments in time for the 70 weeks prophecy, please take a look at the latest series on this channel. Finally, if we consider that we observed earlier, according to the book of Jubilees, there were 49 Jubilees from the time of Adam until the entrance into the land. Then we calculated that when they gained possession of the land, they did this in the 50th Jubilee. So if we add those 50 Jubilees to the 70 Jubilees from their possession of the land until 2036 to 2037, then we find that it brings us to a total of 120 Jubilees since the time of Adam. Why is this significant? At the time of Noah and the flood that wiped out the rest of humanity except for Noah's family, we find that in Genesis 6:3 it states, So Jehovah said, My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal, and his days shall be 120 years. Yeshua also stated, As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. Is this also showing us something important about the next coming Jubilee, which is 120 Jubilees since Adam? Well, keeping with the theme of Noah, I will conclude with this final point. According to Genesis 6:13, we see that it states, And Elohim said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Thus Elohim brought an end to flesh, because violence filled the earth. In Hebrew, the word violence is the word Hamas. So Hamas filled the earth, and this is what brought about destruction. If we look right now at this world, we find protests occurring throughout it, many of which are protests in full support of Hamas. Thus, just as in the days of Noah, Hamas is also filling the earth today. Though physical violence, or Hamas, has filled the earth for thousands of years, this is the first time in human history that a group known as Hamas has gained worldwide recognition and support. I have a hard time believing that all of these times are just a coincidence. It seems to me that if Jehovah orchestrated time and events throughout history to make sure that Daniel 8 and 12 were fulfilled in 1967, and that generation would be complete 70 years later in 2037, which will occur at the end of a Jubilee that just happens to be the 42nd Jubilee since Messiah, the 70th Jubilee since Israel took possession of the land, and the 120th Jubilee since Adam, then Jehovah must have significant plans for the next Jubilee. I would say that what we are about to experience is what I had called previously the crescendo of all prophecy. If you have any thoughts about this coming Jubilee, I would love to hear about them in the comments section. I appreciate the time you have spent watching this video. Thank you and be blessed.